So welcome back to this session, which is called Getting the Story Out. And we have with us some of Australia's most senior editors. They are the people responsible for getting investigative stories out. You can do a great story, but unless it reaches an audience, it's going to come to nothing. So on my right, Paul Ramadge, Editor-in-Chief of The Age. Mark Scott, you've met already. On my left, Anne Davies, Investigations Editor at the Sydney Morning Herald. And of course, Robert Rosenthal, you've met already. The theme of this session is, first of all, why should big media organisations invest in investigative journalism? And then, if they're prepared to do that, how can they get investigative stories out to the biggest audience possible, reach as many people as possible, and how can they use the kinds of technological possibilities that Robert was talking about beforehand to do that? So I'm going to hand you straight over to Paul Ramadge, Editor-in-Chief of The Age. Paul, you can sit.
Okay, oh, fantastic. I've just been told I can sit, so I will. Thank you. And thank you very much for that warm welcome, and thank you for everybody who's turned out today. It's much appreciated. Look, I really would like to start by saying so persuasive, so omnipresent are the arguments that say that newspapers don't have the resources anymore to do investigative journalism, that it is indeed a pleasure to be with you today. We don't need a media inquiry to tell us why investigative journalism matters, although perhaps we do need a media inquiry into why the government thinks today's converged multimedia former newspaper organisations have nothing to do with broadcast journalism. But that's another issue. The first thing I'd like to address is, yes, the world of journalism is changing rapidly. Yes, there is an extremely valuable role to be done by independent investigative journalists away from major newsrooms if they can get sustainable funding and support. And yes, new media means that crowdsourcing projects and database research do offer exciting new ways to do investigative pieces. But let me be clear, the assumption as a result of job cuts and media fragmentation, that quality independent journalism and investigations are no longer possible in major newsrooms, that we are somehow unable or unwilling to do this type of journalism, is rubbish. So far, the American experience is not the Australian experience. The times are tougher, but it is up to the editors to set the resource priorities. At The Age, in tougher times, we have made investigations and breaking news strategies at the heart of our operation. This is how we get the story out. With a staff of 300, it is a no-brainer that investigations are a high priority. Over the past 3 years, we had lifted the number of dedicated staff in our investigation unit from 2 to 6. Their stories appear in print and on our digital platforms, often accompanied by multimedia mini-documentaries. You will hear from 2 of them today, Nick McKenzie and Richard Baker, as they unpack one of their investigations done in collaboration with Four Corners. And Phil Dorling is here too for a panel discussion later in the day. Now, it follows that if you invest and if you train and if you skill and if you are an ideas-based organisation, that you can break major investigations. And this is what The Age has done over the past few years. And you know some of these names when I say them, from Fitzgibbon to Lou to Securrency to World Cup Soccer, and there are many more. We use emerging and newly established media, but in our view, there is no substitute for well-trained, passionate reporters and senior editors being given time and resources to deliver great stories. Now, it's equally important to acknowledge that newspapers in America in particular appear to have been hit extremely hard, resulting in the loss of investigative resources. And it is in this context that initiatives such as the Centre for Investigative Reporting's California Watch deserve applause, as does the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in Britain. In this hyper-connected, extraordinarily fast world, smart collaborations and shared projects on global issues like tobacco, climate change, the ethics of technology and medicine make a lot of sense. It makes sense too to collaborate locally with, for example, technology and database savvy university students and academics, and with other media, as you know, the Age and the ABC, the Sydney Morning Herald and the ABC. But more than anything, I will argue that it makes sense to continue to believe in what can be achieved. The editor-in-chief of The Guardian, Alan Rushbridger, is a believer. And look at the year his paper has had, from WikiLeaks to the phone hacking scandal. Look at the Daily Telegraph in Britain and the manner in which it changed the nature of politics in 2009 by exposing MP expenses scandals. But let's return here to Australia. And in this short time that I have, let me just shine a light on a few dark places. Our journalists at The Age are charged with obtaining documents. They're asked to get leaks. They challenge secrecy. They scrutinise the secret workings of governments and corporations. They try to get beyond press releases and handouts and selective media giveaways dictated by those in power. Put simply, they ask smart questions, and they do this on behalf of the public. And yes, it does sound like a collection of textbook cliches, but the results matter. And in the time allocated, I'd like to address 4 quick points, far from exhaustively, but rather as conversation starters. They are these. If you want investigative journalism, you need to pay. Second, put your flak jacket on. Running investigations is not for the faint-hearted. Third, if you're an editor, prosecute the facts, the words and the tone. And last, investigations are no longer just about words. I just want to talk a little bit about money. Investigations are expensive. They're expensive because well-paid journalists come off day-to-day reporting. Their best work takes time, sometimes months. Some investigations don't produce results. And the published pieces inevitably result in higher legal costs incurred in getting material vetted by lawyers prior to publication, and the risk of significant costs if there is a complaint or litigation. I would like to give you one example. It's the Helen Liu case. The Age's reporting on the relationship between Chinese businesswoman Liu and leading ALP figures resulted in Liu issuing an application in the New South Wales Supreme Court seeking disclosure of our sources. The hearing took about 2 weeks, spread over a few months. It was expensive for both sides and the stakes were high. Although the hearing concluded in February, we have still not received a decision from the court. And this is an important case. It raises fundamental issues about the public's right to know, about freedom of speech and about the protection of sources. And the Age, of course, cannot and will not reveal its sources. In a related action, former Defence Minister Joel Fitzgibbon has issued 6 writs against Fairfax in the Supreme Court of the ACT. We are standing by our reporting and our reporters, and we are setting aside money to do this. And then there's the flak jacket. When you publish investigations in the public interest, it often involves revealing things about powerful, influential bodies, governments, corporations, individuals, and those bodies can react ferociously. I've been screamed at by political minders, threatened by lawyers and abused by litigants. At least one of our reporters has received a chilling call from a criminal. And so with the flak jacket on, my counsel to all editors, to all people engaged in words and images that matter in regard to investigation, is to prosecute those words. Check and double check. Ask to see the documents. Check the tone of the reporting. Be clear about inferences and any unintended meanings. In some measure, go back to basics. Is the issue in the public interest? But ask yourself why. How reliable are our sources? Can we trust them? Are we clear about their motivations and biases? What are the consequences of publication, and are there valid reasons why we shouldn't publish? Are we confident that we'll be able to stand by our actions in a court? And there are so many more questions. This rigour, this craft, this skill is why investigative journalism from experienced media companies is so important. In this 24/7 crush to blog, tweet, report, comment, film, share, trusted, independent, quality journalism really does matter. Now, if you think it doesn't matter, if you think I'm old school and fuddy-duddy, well, let's just imagine life without the Age, without the Sydney Morning Herald, without the Australian, and without the Financial Review. Imagine it, and imagine how many stories don't become public. Now, I know not everybody here would agree with those views, but I'm actually rarely surprised these days about journalism's detractors. The world is changing, values are changing, and how people choose to learn is changing. Many seem to make decisions about the truth after rapid comparative analysis of internet sources and voices. But while the world is changing, getting faster, getting more connected, getting more complex, a portion of what I do, the nitty-gritty heavy lifting of critical decisions about whether or not to publish, has changed little. And now investigations are not just about words. For example, we can now reveal things from data using programs like Document Cloud, Tableau Public, Many Eyes, Google Fusion Tables. We can investigate through crowdsourcing and via social media. We can animate things. And in all of this, just to finish, for those who seek to be engaged, for those who seek to be informed, the challenge is to get beyond the echo chamber of media that simply reinforce your beliefs. Seek credible ideas, cherish them, and put a high value on one of the very special attributes of our democracy, the ability of journalists to expose issues of public importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. There'll be time for some brief questions at the end, but I'm going to hand straight over now to Anne Davies, Investigations Editor at the Sydney Morning Herald.
Okay, well, in such lofty company, I thought perhaps I'd stick to some nuts and bolts and describe to you some of the ways the Sydney Morning Herald, often in partnership with The Age, is experimenting with getting the story out across a range of platforms. Suddenly, with the iPad, we've been freed from the limitations of print, which, though a fantastic medium for telling stories, is really still under some pressure these days. No longer do we have the luxury of 3,000 to 5,000 words in the middle of the week. Often we find that space is constrained both by advertising and by audience preferences for shorter stories. So with the iPad, we've really started opening the door both to longer form journalism and also other ways to tell the story through interactive graphics, short videos and slideshows where we can showcase some of our photographers' world-class work. So I'll just show you a couple of the things we've done. These have mainly been in relation to series, but we're about to start rolling some out for investigations. If you could just open up the one on the Power series, if it'll work, I hope. Okay, this is an interactive graphic that we prepared to when we looked at the 50 most powerful people in New South Wales. And if we go to business, I'll show you what we did with it. So we identified the 5 key people in business in New South Wales, and then when you click on David Gonski, who's probably the most networked man in Australia, you can see he sits there, and below are a whole lot of links to people he's connected with in business, politics, and in philanthropy and the arts. So if you just click on one of those little yellow links for me, then we can call up the other person. Now, this was one of our first efforts at this, and so we're hoping that we can do a whole lot more of these things that allow people to browse through the research that we'd otherwise struggle to present. The Fin Review does something similar to this, but they devote a whole magazine to it. So we're hoping this is going to be the new way that we can present a lot more data to our audiences. The next one we did, if you don't mind going back, is the state budget, and this was one we turned around really quickly. Okay, it gives you the big numbers, the headline numbers for the budget, and then when you click on it, it starts spilling out how the budget breaks down, and then you can click on each of those and you can break it down even further into programs and where the money's being spent. Okay, and then I'll just show you one other one, which is something we did for September 11.
The graphic or before and after?
Beg your pardon? It's the graphic, yeah. Okay, so this one tracks the plane flights in real time as they come into their the targets that they were aiming at. So it was a way of just recounting the events. And then they start pulsing, and you can click on them and open up a graphic of what happened at the site. And so it has more information. And, you know, so what we're trying to do is draw people into the layers of information. Okay. We've got a really fabulous data visualisation that's going to be coming up next week for an investigation by my colleague Linton Besser. Sadly, I can't tell you much about it at this stage, but it's based on a large amount of data that we got obtained under FOI. Normally we'd really struggle to present all this data in an interesting way, but we think we've come up with a really great way that will allow people to spend some time trawling through it themselves and understanding what we've written and drawing their own conclusions about it. There's a slight downside to all this multimedia world. It can take a lot longer to get everything together, and we have to plan far more ahead, which is quite a difficult thing for us who come from daily journalism. We've now appointed a person whose sole responsibility is to wrangle these multi-headed beasts into submission. Each week we have a meeting on Tuesdays where we run through this incredible spreadsheet about where everybody's up to on the videos, the multimedia presentations, the words, and to some extent, you know, the involvement of online, to try and make sure that we're all going to meet the single deadline. And so it's quite difficult. I'm sure people who work in television go, yeah, we do this all the time, but it's quite new to us. Paul's talked about his investigative team's collaborative work with Four Corners, which allows a story to be told on television and in print. And I'd have to say, I still think that's the most effective means of getting real political bang for your buck. If you can have something in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age on a Monday, followed up by Four Corners or led by Four Corners and then followed up by us on Tuesdays, I think that's probably the best chance we have of budging the politicians to move in the direction that we want them to go. It also has allowed us to husband resources so that expensive trips like Marion Wilkinson's trip to Antarctica a couple of years ago before Copenhagen were possible. Otherwise they're just not possible to do. Our next frontier is to involve our website in more projects. Recently we had a huge cache of documents from the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, who we work with on some projects, and they detailed Australia's policies on detention of prisoner of war in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And what we discovered was that we sort of had this legal fiction that people who were detained by Australian forces were actually arrested by the one American that we always had travelling with the Australian forces. And so, you know, this was a really interesting investigation. We had a whole lot of documents, and we used Document Cloud and the website to put it up there so people could go and have a look themselves. So our challenge now is to encourage the website, which is very much focused on daily journalism, to give us a little bit of space or a portal so that we can bring our readers in to look at these sort of, you know, treasure troves of data or documents, or, you know, watch videos there as well. We're still looking for that elusive person for our newsroom, a technically gifted, numerate journalist with great writing skills, great visual skills, who can turn a spreadsheet into a work of art, and also be plugged into what the Gen Y people want and keep them interested in what we're doing. We've actually discovered, as we've started doing these projects, that we've got a whole lot of people in the office, in the library, the web designers down on the second floor, our graphic artists, our video guys. We've discovered we've got all these great talents. We've just got to try and corral them all together to make these projects happen. There may be another frontier as well that we've got to conquer. Fairfax TV has started embedding its apps in all new TVs sold in Australia. And it might be a while before Mark Scott has to worry about his ratings, but sooner or later I can see us also pushing video out on our new Fairfax TV service. I think there's going to be a place in Australia for a think tank like Robert's organisation, but as several speakers have mentioned, there's not the culture of philanthropy here in Australia to tip money into journalism. Now that might be about to change. I don't know how many of you know, but there is another start-up in the wings funded by a wealthy person who wants to see more long-form journalism. It's going to be a web-only product, which I think will concentrate on what they say, the stories that are not getting out there. At this stage, I think they're planning to go it alone, but hopefully in the future we can do some collaborative projects with that new venture as well. But just to come back to Paul's point, I think it doesn't matter how much technology and innovation you have. There's going to be no substitute for a great story, vigorous research, and a sceptical, inquiring mind. The investment in human capital in journalism is just going to be the most important ingredient, and let me assure you, both The Age and the Herald remain committed to doing that. So if this is your thing, please apply for our internships, come and work with us, because we're looking for people who want to get into investigative journalism.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne. And I think we may just have that person that you're looking for your newsroom, and they're almost certainly going to be a UTS graduate. Mark.
Yeah, but they should talk to us as well. Just a few quick observations already spoken this morning. Just quickly on what Anne was saying about philanthropy. I think one of the questions that I still had after Robert's presentation this morning is that, in a sense, there have been tensions between advertisers and editorial in newspapers, but it's an indirect funding model. I think with philanthropy you've got a direct funding model, and I think one of the questions that I still have are, will philanthropists fund journalism, independent, impartial journalism, go and find that story wherever it lies? Or will philanthropists really often have a point of view, a worldview, a political perspective that they are seeking to pursue? And I think, you know, some of the models, I think, that we have seen emerge here in an embryonic sense have been because there's a sense that there are kinds of stories and perspectives that have been neglected. And so therefore, in a sense, you're funding more of a journalistic outcome or a journalistic point of view rather than the process. So I think that'll be an interesting tension to manage over time. I also suspect that in an Australian market, which is significantly smaller than the States, you said, Robert, this morning that there is a sense that people are pursuing unique stories but not exclusive stories. I still think there's a premium around exclusivity here. I think that we've seen partnerships emerge The Age or the Herald working with the ABC, but there's a sense that that will be an exclusive held in one or two media outlets rather than ubiquitously being shared everywhere. And I think you do get stories that are shared everywhere, but they are just stories rather than taken up and promoted in an investigative mode. If I can just talk briefly about Four Corners, I think it's a great case study of the tremendous opportunities that exist in this era for investigative journalism. And I don't think the challenges around the business model should dishearten us. I think the opportunities that exist in the digital world are wonderful and should give a richness and a depth and a texture to the quality of investigations in a way that we would have never envisaged in the past. And Four Corners, I think, is a great snapshot of that because you have that 50 years of history. And in a sense, if you look back into the early years of Four Corners, 40 minutes, 45 minutes of primetime television, a way of telling a complex story, that was great. It was a luxury then. To a degree, it's a luxury now, that time and that space and that investment. But now Four Corners is so much more than a television program. They were pioneers here at the ABC about creating a rich website which allows so much more information to be conveyed than could possibly be conveyed in a 45-minute television program. One of the things I like, and I think is a key of a new era of investigative journalism, is greater transparency into the process. One of the things that any journalist will say is no matter how, if they've got 45 minutes on air or 5,000 words in the paper, the tragedy is what gets thrown out. And a lot of the controversy is about what do you choose to put in that editorial selection process. Well, now Four Corners, if you go to the website, you see the full interviews. So you can look at what we chose, but you can see the full interview and you can, in a sense, come to judgment yourself as to whether the editorial selection process gave a fair depiction of the information that we received. And I think that fullness and richness that the web as a supplement to what you broadcast or what you write can bring, as Anne has illustrated, I think is tremendous. One of the things I would anticipate that will emerge, certainly with television programs, is far more of, in a sense, a two-screen viewing experience. The program is on air, but sent to your iPhone or your iPad is the supplementary supporting material, the background data, the research, that at the time you can pause the television set and read that article, or you can pause and watch the full interview if you like, but it is there and giving our audiences far more complete picture, complete information than they'd have ever had in the past. And of course, I think implicit in what we've heard earlier too is, and what Robert illustrated, is a sense that you can't just wait and hope that your audience comes to you with this content. You've got to be very aggressive and assiduous in taking this content to the audience at a time they want, on a device they want, in a format that they want. So Four Corners, once just a television program, now, of course, we broadcast it on air still, we replay it up online, we broadcast it on iView, we broadcast it on News 24 at other times, an Australia network. But one of the interesting moments for me was when Four Corners created its own Facebook page, recognising that the amount of time Australians spend on Facebook is very high, as high as anywhere in the world, that there is a significant portion of the audience that's spending nearly all their online time on Facebook. And rather than Four Corners trying to lure that Facebook crowd to the ABC or the Four Corners website, we needed, in effect, to rebuild great elements of the Four Corners website on Facebook where the audience was. And so a sense that we have this great content, but we have to find ways of packaging it and delivering it and finding the audience where the audience is rather than hoping that they come to us. And so I would have thought that Four Corners reporters now, and they're speaking here and you can ask them about it if you're interested, spend far more time in the days immediately of the program going to air selling and promoting their stories, doing a range of media interviews, doing television, radio, print issues, more follow-up, in the sense to make sure as many people as possible can experience the richness of the journalism as it's been borne out.
Thank you very much, Mark. And my two 11 and 13-year-old sons spend a lot of time on Facebook too, but so far I haven't caught them on the Four Corners page.
Only a matter of time.
We can only hope. Now look, I'm very conscious of the fact that being journalists we're always pushing deadlines, And I'm also conscious of the fact that very shortly we'll have the Australian Information Commissioner speaking. But I would like to have a brief response from Robert and just maybe one or two questions from the floor.
Yeah, I thank you. You're hearing a lot of things I agree with, and practically everything, and very wise counsel. Just a couple of quick points. One, I think collaboration is really crucial, and you're hearing that happening here. And I think competition at the same time is really important. But there will be some stories that you as an organization, I think, can't do as well as you could do somehow through collaboration. And the genesis for me was in the Bay Area before I got to CIR, between jobs. There was a journalist named Chauncey Bailey who was literally assassinated. He ran a weekly paper in Oakland, California, and one morning, August 2007, he was going to work, and a guy ran up with a shotgun and literally blew his head off. And a group of journalists in the Bay Area who knew him really wanted to try and solve the crime, and I got involved in that. But the thing that really was astonishing was the multi-platform approach again, and the ability to simultaneously get a story out in a big market where you had radio, you had TV broadcast, you had print, you had websites, you had ethnic media, you had weekly newspapers working together. And when those stories were pushed out, they completely saturated the market, and they led to huge reforms, as well as the arrest and the conviction of two men who are now in jail for life. So it was a really great example around the killing of a journalist that brought people together. But one way we addressed this issue of exclusivity and who had it first, everybody has a website. So the stories were released simultaneously on everyone's website. And for a newspaper, if it was at 10 o'clock at night, they published in the morning. The TV stations had it in the evening. But again, the power of the collaboration led to huge results. And we all think about our news organization, but if the goal is to try and evoke change or have an impact, sometimes that collaboration serves a much greater purpose, and everybody benefits. The other thing, quickly, is I think we all need to think about, and you're hearing about it in ways, is how we take an investigative story and create utility and usefulness out of it. And I think the ability now to take, again, the essence of a story, not just if you're doing a piece, like I mentioned, seismic safety. We did an app which would show anybody where they were literally in California in terms of where fault lines were, and seismic safety zones and liquefaction zones. So we distilled the essence of the story and made it relevant to you, so that you could get that app and see where you were, or where your kid's school was, and also a lot of useful information about what to do, where emergency centers were around an earthquake. And I think there are niches of interest. That has a pretty broad base, but we also did something recently. We're showing where every bill in the California legislature, a list of who the lobbyists were for the bill. And that might not be of broad interest to the general public, but it was really a hot item in the Capitol and among a lot of the politicians. So some things are not going to be broad, but things are going to be really highly relevant and useful. So again, taking that big package of information, how do you distill it into apps that will work, and be relevant to somebody actually in their lives? And we're all doing stories. It could be about what, in the States, which doctors are getting funds from pharmaceutical companies to push certain drugs. That's public record. It's available. Maybe when you're going into your doctor's office, you want to see ask questions about, why am I getting this drug? And you can get the information. My doctor's getting, $25,000 in fees. So it's really hyper-localizing and individualizing content is something that we all should be thinking about.
Well, look, we've got time for just one or two very brief questions. Do we have a question?
Yes, just picking up on what Robert was saying, I'd like to ask the Australian participants, do you think, just listening to you talk, it's fair to say that in Australia so far we've mainly been thinking about things like Facebook, even to some extent iPad, although I don't think so much there, but particularly Facebook, how to extend the audience, how to reach people, rather than actually thinking about how to use new media to tell stories in different ways, how to actually involve the audience and maybe repackage the story, not necessarily into much deeper, more complex formats, but actually perhaps into more accessible formats for some, audiences as well. So I'd just like to ask you that. And do you think we're still hampered by the silos, you know, between, for example, a Fairfax, and you're still talking about the, the newspaper and trying to get together with the online, which seems to be an ongoing problem. So I'd just like to ask, I guess, that from a slightly more critical perspective.
Okay, well, we are trying to get over the what was a structural separation in the company, and it's rapidly breaking down. So hopefully we now try and talk about the newsroom, which is a bunch of people who are delivering content for various platforms. So that's one thing we're trying to overcome. I sort of agree with you. We did a whole lot of experiments around Twitter and Facebook during the state election, and while I think Twitter has its place in the sort of political discourse, it's actually not that useful except as a marketing tool, I think. And Facebook we've used intermittently, but unfortunately we need to make money, and so there's always this question about how do you monetise around your content, and so that's been a bit of an issue around just pushing things out on Facebook.
I'd just like to talk to the 2 points that you raised. First of all, from Fairfax's experience, certainly one newsroom is emerging very, very quickly at the moment, and we don't talk so much about print, but we talk about media and the best way to do it on each of the platforms at particular times of the day. To the other point about, which I'm summarising as an issue of engagement, I have been drawn to consider the work of Brian Stelter of the New York Times, who covers entertainment, and we were lucky to invite Jay Rosen, the New York academic, to The Age just recently, and he was telling us quite a bit about Brian, and quickly and anecdotally, he might be writing a story about somebody, comes into the office at 9:30 in the morning, first thing he does is he tweets. And he sends out a tweet saying, I'm doing a story on George Jones today, has anybody got a good question? Or has anybody got issues they'd like me to raise in the interview? He then turns away from that to the telephone and starts working the phone like a traditional print journalist, doing a story on this, just seeking your comment, can I have a coffee with this afternoon, etc. During the day he goes back and forth, and he's building, I'm told, quite a reputation for smart, highly collaborative crowdsourcing using Twitter and merging that with traditional journalism practices. And I'm drawn to consider that quite a lot at the moment as to the extent to which we can do it in Australia. And one thing that, and we're doing a bit of it, but it's more experimental than as considered as that. And one thing I'd say is, it's something that Mark mentioned earlier, is I think to do that fulsomely, Australian journalism will have to kind of get over the notion of exclusivity on every platform. I think crowdsourcing and engagement is actually a much more transparent, free process.
Now look, it breaks my heart to have to do this, but I'm going to have to now draw a close to this session, because we've heard a lot about FOI, about documents in the last few minutes, and we are in a moment going to have the man who's in charge of FOI throughout Australia, Professor John McMillan, speaking to us. And I would say also that tomorrow in the first session there's going to be an opportunity to talk more particularly about these issues in relation to social media. So would you please join me in thanking all of our panellists very much indeed for